Okay, I'm Carmen Llanes-Pulido. I'm the executive director of Go Austin, Vamos Austin, and also a native Austinite, and grew up in part right around here in East Austin. I've been doing community organizing mostly in Austin, mostly in what they call Austin's Eastern Crescent now for the last 15 years. I grew up here and then went away to school in Chicago. I learned a lot about neoliberal economic policies, and at the same time was really blessed to have teachers from my community in East Austin give me the environmental justice history of where I came from, and so I was able to put those things into context, and that's informed a lot of my work as a community organizer, also as a city commissioner, both for Latino quality of life and in planning and land use. GAVA, Go Austin, Vamos Austin, is a community organizing nonprofit and coalition. So we work directly with people who live, work, and worship in Southeast Austin, South Austin, and also North Central Austin, in some of the areas where we see the most health and economic disparities, but where communities are chaining together in these really powerful networks with a lot of partners and institutions to change this stuff. And that's everything from how easy it is to eat healthy food in your neighborhood and get around and be active and have clean and healthy, safe green spaces that you can use, to being able to stay in your neighborhood and have neighborhood stability in the face of things like gentrification or flooding and climate disasters. So we work in communities that experience a lot of those things and have a lot of lived experience and history that informs a more equitable process that can support the whole city to have better quality of life. I think about as a child when my parents were really involved in either neighborhood issues, environmental justice issues, or arts, politics, whatever it was. I was one of those kids who was coloring in the back of meetings. Sometimes I was on my parents' back. My dad actually talks about meetings at City Hall and allies in the community who remember me from when I was little. So I kind of grew up in it, and I don't think I really considered the influence of it until later. I grew up really in Old West Austin, coming over to East Austin and living back and forth in the two places. And I think I saw and felt the differences, both in the community and in just like the support and services for the city and the condition of things and what people were going through. But I didn't have a context for that or really understand what it meant or how that got there until I was a young scholar for justice with Poder. And it was through that leadership development program that I learned why there's an East Austin, why things look the way that they do, what is the history that got us here, and that was very transformative for me. But as a kid, I think I was just sort of tagging along and knew that my parents were going to a lot of meetings. And now I'm actually doing community work with people whose kids are those kids coloring in meetings. And I hope that it rubs off on them too, that like just a few people coming together can really change things.
Can you talk about the Young Scholars Program a little bit?
Sure. In the early 90s, Poder formed first as an organization, as a nonprofit. People organized in defense of Earth and her resources to continue the organizing work of communities of color in East Austin, cleaning up industrial sites, getting industrial zoning out of residential areas and keeping people safe. And very quickly realized that it was important to share this lived history and this organizing work with younger generations and keep it going. So leadership development became a focus, and the Young Scholars for Justice program was born out of that. A lot of really powerful community leaders in Austin went through that program, and I think it's easy to take for granted the influence that Poder really had. So in the mid-90s, well into Poder's work to get rid of other industrial polluters, very quickly they saw the need to incorporate leadership development and particularly work with youth. So the intergenerational model is one of the most important things about that grassroots organizing, because it brings elders and young adults and youth, young people, teenagers together, learning and sharing that oral history, starting to learn how power and systems work, how our city works, how financial institutions work, but very much contextualized in a community conversation. that program gave tons of context and education to a number of emerging leaders who, I won't name drop them here, but they've filled very prominent roles in our community, from important educational roles at UT to our city council to various boards and commissions, and a lot of different important community work. And so that investment every year, no matter what the funding is for Poder or the staffing situation, they always have a youth component. There are always young people who are not only listening and learning, but also contributing and articulating through art and poetry and public testimony their view as young people. And that's a really important part of how that environmental justice work has been able to go on. So now, as a community organizer, as an organizational leader, and also as a City of Austin commissioner, I always take that context of lived history, equity, environmental justice, understanding the context of where we as people live, work, learn, play, and worship, not just what's valued as a dollar amount. And that has informed everything from my policy decisions as a commissioner to the way that I've built a staff and team and partnerships at GAVA, because I think it's critical to always center the people who have lived through the issues we're talking about. And as people are learning and growing their edges, we all have something to contribute. And so that's been part of my approach always. And I think one of the most important things I've taken away from living with the history of the tank farms and the aftermath is that we can always reframe the story. A few people, even if they don't have a lot of institutional power, can collectively move power and change things. And we're always going to need to continue to build a base of leadership and invest in our communities and figure out how to keep more of the resources in our communities, or we're going to lose that. It's always going to be, there's always going to be another struggle until we get true, equality in wealth, racial equity. We are going to have to invest in a base that can continually transform our systems. I think there's something a lot more concise that I want to say there, and I'm kind of getting there, but I guess what I'm getting at is now I'm seeing more and more the stark difference between the true value of not just community, but our environment, the whole sort of human elements that make life livable, and how those things are often not documented on paper in a return on investment. So we have to be really careful in our land use decisions and our policy decisions. We can't just look at numbers. We need data, we need numbers, but we also have to understand that lived experience is data, and that all of these external factors, the air that we breathe, literally, the green space around us, our ability to connect, to stay in one place, as a household, as a community, all of those things impact those numbers too. So as we build a better understanding of lived history and equity, I think we're getting closer to there. But it's tough because resources are scarce, and we're a growing city. And we have to figure out a way to grow equitably and manage our resources in a way that the same people don't have to keep suffering and rebuilding over and over again. Our history is a treasure trove. It's a treasure trove of tools that we've used in the past or that maybe we could adapt and use now. It's a reminder of how much people before us have gone through. The work I'm doing now is only possible because people double and triple and quadruple my age broke down so many barriers and built up so much to foster my upbringing as a community leader. So we have lessons to learn. We have a trajectory to plot based on the history that got us here. And I think most importantly, what it's taught me as a land use commissioner is that land use is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to, environmental justice, health equity, racial justice, the wealth divide. What we do with land, as the city of Austin, this is the only place we can really regulate. and interrupt the market that has disadvantaged certain people over and over again. So we can go for all kinds of wonderful policies that, you know, represent a more socially just society, but if we don't talk about the land and people's ability to stay here, to live here, the ability of the ecosystem to continue to repair itself, then none of that really matters. Because if you can't stay in Austin, what good is Austin's progressive agenda, right? And if your environment is degraded, what good is it to have access to that green space if it's poisonous to you, right? So we have to figure out a way to factor those things in. And our history has a lot to offer us to figure it out. I think there was no doubt for the people living next to the tanks that there was something wrong with their health tied to those tanks and that they were experiencing direct contamination. And what's interesting about this very historical moment for Austin is that it takes place in the context of the environmental justice movement across the country. And so there were EJ leaders talking to, you know, the leaders who became Poder and saying, you know, if you get these tanks out, you know what's going to happen. Your taxes are going to go up, people are going to want to move in, it's going to, you know, you're going to get gentrified. And that was a real decision at the time. They knew that they were going to have to look at all of these issues, and that's where land use and neighborhood planning became really important for this side of town, because it wasn't just about eliminating the harmful industrial zoning from the 50s, it was also about creating space for more housing, for more residential space, and allowing the neighborhood to negotiate what it looked like. So there's only one site that's been cleaned up to residential standards, and it was negotiated into a very successful mixed income multifamily development subsidized by the Cesar Chavez Foundation. And that was only made possible because of that community collaboration from the get-go to get the tanks out, then to look responsibly at land use. And so it's very much an ongoing conversation. It doesn't stop with just one contamination site or one plan. We always have to be looking to the future and seeing how can we negotiate and plan growth and change and environmental sustainability around the people who are most impacted. That's always super important. And that continues to be a conversation today. Where have industrial sites gone? The tank farms got consolidated, so they didn't move to someone else's backyard. But that's not true for all of our industrial sites, you know, that have gone farther out, and now you have rural or urban communities around there. Who's impacted? It's always communities of color, particularly Black, African American, and usually Mexican American, Latino communities that are impacted. So this is going to continue to be an issue for us, and we're going to have to figure out a way to get cleaner as a society, you know, pollute less, period, so nobody has to live next to it, and plan more equitably. I don't think I had any idea how lucky I was at the time to be surrounded by natural spaces. And even with whatever contamination there still was in East Austin, there's beautiful green spaces here. And just, I think I appreciated after I left Austin and lived in a big city like Chicago, and the only wilderness you have there is Lake Michigan, pretty much. And then coming back here, I realized that, oh, like this balance of green space and humanity and the urban canopy is a lot of what makes Austin so special. It's a lot of what makes life livable, and it's a lot of where you actually see the interruption with that contamination, right? Like I can hear 3 or 4 different types of birds right now in the food chain. I grew up watching these huge leafcutter ants, and I was 4.5 minutes from downtown. So that's not everybody's experience in Austin, but that foundational piece, I think, I know what there is to lose. I swam in Barton Springs before Circle C was developed. I know what it looked like. I know how clear it was and how many more fish and turtles there were in the water we used to swim in, right? The people who grew up 2-3 generations before me in East Austin used to play in Waller Creek, you know, or play in Boggy Creek before it was concrete channels. So when you've seen that, you know what we've lost, And you also know what we have left to lose. And if there's one thing I've learned, is that there's always more left to lose. So there's always something to fight for, and there's things that you can't ever get back. But there are also places where we can let the ecosystem do its thing, and it can actually really help us. Like in Watershed in Southeast Austin, instead of fighting over getting the drainage ditches mowed every time the grass grows over, how can we think about working with the vegetation to soak up some of that water and help us out? So we have to do less maintenance, and we're getting a little more oxygen, a little more carbon sequestration along the way. So I think, you know, that was a really important foundation. It's not just a luxury. Green space, ecotherapy, all these buzzwords now, that stuff's essential to living, for sure. At the end of the day, I think, as cliche as it is, or I think there's a famous quote, you know, that ordinary people do extraordinary things. And I think it's really important for us to remember that it's regular folks who care about their kids, their community, their neighbors, you know, who move mountains in some cases, you know, a few organized people. I don't know of another case of low-income communities of color kicking out 6 transnational oil companies. The big ones that everybody knows the names of, you know, that you hear about people in Nigeria, you know, fighting their cases of contamination and labor rights and all those things. Like, I feel connected to that in a way, because we had our own struggle with these transnational oil companies here, and it was communities of color in East Austin. That is an internationally important story, that people did it with about $2,000, and a lot of people, a lot of heads, and a lot of hearts. And that is what organizing is. It's regular folks. It's not activism. It's not the loudest voices. Sometimes voices, people get well known because they always show up, right? But the real truth is like when you see people in the community. People, I think a lot of folks in Austin take for granted somebody like Susanna seems like just that one person you see at all the meetings. But if you walk in the community with her, people know her. Everybody knows her, right? She gets those calls late in the night that we don't hear about. Just like all of us who are really tied to our communities, we get those calls late at night. We hear those concerns all the time, right? And then you could walk into some indigenous communities in South America, and people know her there too, because this work has linked some of us globally to other environmental justice communities. So there's an extraordinary, powerful history here, and it's regular folks that are too easy to take for granted. And I think everybody has a story like that. Everybody has lessons in their life that we can learn from. We just we have to figure out a way to value that stuff more institutionally.